And now I'm going to be turning it over back again to Greg at Strategy Analytics. And he's going to have another panel for you about media and its perception of automotive cybersecurity. So thanks again, panelists. And everyone, please, if you have questions for this next panel, switch over to that inside of the SwapCard platform and post those questions directly to the chat window. And at that, Greg, how's it going? How are you this afternoon?
Hey, doing okay? Doing well. So, Joby, do you want to provide a little background, or I can do the intro, and then if you want to add any commentary to the intro here, feel free to let me know. Just because, as we discussed prior to the panel, you have some personal thoughts on this, and I think it would be helpful to get the industry perspective as well as the journalist perspective.
Sure, I'll kind of start off because this started as a brainchild of the Geneva Security Organization, right? So before we get in there, and I appreciate Pete and Ed for showing up, and we had a slight last minute change though for those of you that were unaware. We had a last minute conflict, so thanks Ed for joining in the last minute. But the kind of thing is that I've worked in the industry for an OEM. I now work for a supplier. And those of you that are in the industry, you know that there is a lot of information that comes out, especially if we have something like a vehicle hack that happens, right? And so it's kind of, if you have Google Newsfeed set up like I do, you get a notification, you're like, wait a second, that's not really how that happened, or that I don't know if that's possible, or maybe that was possible, but that car's 3 years old, so that's all been fixed now, right? So I kind of proposed it to the team and said, why are we getting this type of information, right? It's not that the media or anybody is wrong. It's maybe that information isn't widely available enough to say, hey, here's the reason why. And then, so I kind of talked to Greg a bit about it, and then I'll hand it over to you to say your half of the story, right?
Sure. So obviously, when we're talking about how the media is writing anything, there are a lot of different constraints on the time frame you have to write stories, your contacts, level of access, and we're going to be discussing all of those things on the panel today. So just to get started, I'm going to ask my co-panelists here to introduce themselves. First, Pete, you're with Automotive. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. And hello, everybody. I'm Pete Bigelow, senior reporter at the Automotive News, where I cover a lot of topics that fall into the connected, automated, shared, and electric realm. And within that, a lot of automotive cybersecurity coverage as well. Been at the Automotive News for just about 2 years now, and been covering automotive in general for a decade.
Cool, great. Ed, so just as some background, my colleague Ed Sanchez, yes, he works for Strategy Analytics. Now he is an analyst, but his background prior to joining Strategy Analytics was as a consumer enthusiast automotive journalist. So Ed, can you talk a little bit about where you worked before and your background in journalism prior to joining SA?
Sure. Yeah, for probably the better part of 15 years, as Greg mentioned, I covered I did have a brief stint in B2B automotive journalism with Greg, actually. We've known each other for quite a while. But just prior to Strategy Analytics, I worked for Motor Trend as their news editor, and then after that for Truck Trend, which is kind of a sister publication that covers the light truck market. So I bring, I guess, more of a kind of a consumery perspective to it, and also, which we'll get into a little later, obviously, the digitization of media, I think, has had a big impact on kind of the prioritization and the socialization of stories. So, but we'll dig into that a little later. So,
yes, so I've been an analyst for about 7 years with Strategy Analytics. So my journalism days are a little behind me at this point. However, prior to joining SA, I was a B2B automotive journalist covering everything from automotive electronics to fleet for about 13 years. So I have pretty good memory of my days as a journalist, and in a lot of ways, a lot of the skills and the ways you approach things do transfer over. And it's a good comparison between nowadays me being an analyst and how I can dig very deeply into topics such as automotive cybersecurity and the kind of access I have versus when I was a journalist, where you were very much under deadline and you have to cover a very, very wide range of topics. And it can be a bit more challenging to dig incredibly deeply on any given subject area, especially when it's part of a broader remit. You're covering automotive across all these topics very broadly. So to get started, one of the first things I wanted to ask, Pete, why don't I'll ask you first, and then Ed, you can chime in after that. So when you're writing about the subject of automotive cybersecurity, what prompts you to write a story about that in the first place? Why are you going to cover it? And it could be either in a news story, what's going to prompt you to write a news story about it, or what would prompt you to write a longer piece on the subject? So Pete, you mind talking about that a bit?
No, not at all. That's a good question. And in a way, I think it kind of goes back to what you were just talking about as far as timeframes go. Obviously, if there's a breach that's in the news, that's something that I'm writing about. I probably have about 30 minutes to turn a story around. If it's something that deserves a longer look, hopefully I can take a couple of weeks or months to really dig into, research that story. But to basically answer your question, what prompts me to write about it would be, I think about security breaches, obviously, are news and they're news quickly. I think some of the other stories I've written about lately are, some of the different ways some of the startups in the cybersecurity space have approached automotive security. And in part, that's probably because startups are obviously eager to get their names out there, and they're looking for some publicity on the work that they're doing versus the OEMs who probably prefer not to talk about this topic on the whole.
Got it. Okay. So Ed, when you were back just a few years ago, when you were writing, if anything related to cybersecurity came up, obviously I think everybody is aware of the GPAC, published in Wired.
Yeah.
So Ed, what prompted you to cover the subject? Because obviously you're doing news, really for Motor Trend and for Truck Trend. So what would prompt you to cover
I mean, kind of like what Pete said, it's timeliness. I did daily. Sometimes I've done as many as a dozen. I hesitate to call them stories, more like posts. But a dozen individual articles a day, that's on the higher side for what I usually did. But there's definitely that kind of quantitative expectation. So, if you saw something trending or getting a lot of attention, obviously you just kind of had to jump on it and try to report and analyze it as best you can. But, when you're under the gun, you just kind of got to run with it. And like I said earlier, there is a little, it wasn't really blatant, but there was this kind of underlying pressure to, I wouldn't say sensationalize, but kind of fine tune the headlines and kind of the approach a little bit by, how much traction you think it would get. So, I was joking with Greg earlier. I said, I'll have to go back and see how they actually covered it, but, and not to, impugn their reputation, but they kind of have one anyway. Jalopnik might have written, your Jeep is out to kill you or something like that, so I think for me personally, it's like, yeah, look, I know clicks and page views are important, but personally, I aim to try to bring a fairly level-headed perspective to things like, okay, this is what you may have heard. This is what it really means. The best I could. And again, I was more of a generalist. I covered, if it had four wheels and a bed or a hatch on it, I covered it. Because trucks are broadly defined, or anywhere from a Buick Encore to Ford Super Duty. So. Pretty much if it fell somewhere in that spectrum, I covered it. So,
right, anything cyber related that came up, that would
exactly,
any kind of breach, whatever, would prompt you to want to investigate that. So back to Pete. Do you want to talk a little bit about when you're tackling the subject of cybersecurity? One of the challenges I think we run into, both as analysts and of course as journalists primarily, is how much research and how much time can you devote to understanding a really complex subject? Like as an analyst, I've done a lot of coverage of the subject of cybersecurity and have had the chance to read a lot of technical documentation, talk to a lot of experts, and understand things much better than I say, maybe than I would have as a journalist when I was covering other areas, such as like fleet, for example. So Pete, when you're doing research on a story, how much time do you think you can devote to really, really deeply understanding the subject versus you just have a story and you have to write it, especially because you're covering such a wide remit. You're covering all the case, connectivity, autonomy, mobility, shared. It's a very wide remit. So what's your approach to writing an article, and how deeply do you think you can delve into researching a given subject? What are the constraints you're under?
Sure. Well, I think to kind of give the example of the 30-minute story that I'm writing, like something just happened and my editor needs something as quickly as possible. I think the important thing there is to kind of like attend conferences like this, for one example, and have a pretty good background knowledge on a subject, so that I can bring some context to whatever the news of the day is pretty quickly. And that's something that I, not to speak ill of any colleagues, but I think that's something that's missing in a lot of coverage that I see, is just kind of how are we able to quickly and effectively put something in its proper context. But then I think for the longer story, where I have a couple days, couple weeks to research something, that's probably when I have more time to make a dozen phone calls, talk to people, have them point me in the right direction on some of those kind of more technical documents you mentioned. And as long as it's like the urgency is either immediate or I've got plenty of time to do that stuff. And how I work it into my, my day when I've got the whole case spectrum to cover is, that's kind of on me. But it's nice to not have the immediacy, and then I do have time to research something more deeply.
Okay. So Ed, when you were writing, say, a longer feature article, what was your approach? Who would you talk to? What were some of the constraints you were under? How did you go about doing that? Say, covering something pretty technical and possibly sensitive, such as cybersecurity.
Sure. I mean, obviously, kind of, start with. I think the key difference now as an analyst versus, when I was with the magazine, is the knowledge of supplier relationships. Because as an automotive journalist, you kind of have a top level view of, the OEM players and that kind of segmentation. But in terms of a lot of the supplier relationships, either they're not very widely publicized, or you kind of have to know who's doing what for who. So in a lot of cases, some of the nuances kind of involve like tier ones, but obviously what the public perceives is the brands, is
right.
Toyota, Buick, whatever. So I usually probably start with the OEMs. If I had knowledge of tier one involvement with something, I'd try to get in contact with them, try to get their input. But as I'm sure all of us have experienced, there's a fine line between storytelling and crisis management, especially if something's kind of timely and not necessarily very favorable to a certain company. They kind of go into damage control mode, and they either kind of shut down, or they kind of put kind of a rose-colored perspective on things. So sometimes it's kind of tricky to kind of cut through that and kind of get to the core issue. But I'm not a believer in kind of gotcha journalism where you're like, but I do like kind of peeling back the layers a little bit when I can, to try to give a little more context to the story. But sometimes it can be challenging. If they don't want to talk to you, it's it may not be a deliberate blacklisting or kind of a stonewalling, but either they're dealing with a lot of inquiries at the same time, and they're just kind of triaging, okay, who's most important here, or you're just not, frankly, just not very important in the greater scheme of things in their view.
Yeah.
So
on the OEM side. Yeah, and this is specifically talking about the media relations people that work for automakers that journalists deal with. So in general, just for those of you who don't have, aren't familiar with how most journalists, at least in terms of how we communicate with the OEMs, most automakers have a media, a website that they direct you to. Usually you're registered, and they have media contacts on there. And those are the people who you're supposed to reach out to when you're approaching the automakers about things. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is just constraints in general, in terms of getting access to the right people. Because one of the key challenges I think we face in covering anything sensitive, it could be any kind of thing related to a recall, anything related to cybersecurity, of course, is the fact that because it's sensitive, you have to talk to the right people, but you also have to tread somewhat carefully in terms of how you can cover it, because you want to have access and you don't want to burn your sources, but you also want to report as best you can on what's out there. And of course, getting that access is also can be challenging from time to time. Sometimes, like my colleague Ed was saying, automakers want to issue the media relations people and PR people for an automaker want to issue a PR statement, a media statement, a general statement, and don't want to provide much more detail out of fear of possible liability, legal implications, right? So I understand where they're coming from, but as a journalist, you're just trying to do your job. You want to report as best you can to your audience. So Pete, how do you feel about, say, some of the constraints on reporting on sensitive topics and issues around access to the automakers and the engineering people and suppliers and their engineers in terms of talking about something that can be sensitive?
Yeah, I'll kind of go back to something I referenced before, Greg, and having gone to so many conferences, I feel like I've made relationships with people over the years, so I can call them in a pinch and say, "Hey, I'm working on a story about, this big thing that just happened," and have an unvarnished conversation with them, and kind of build that truthful context. Like maybe I don't reference them in the story. It's not necessarily something where I'm going to use their name. So, but just something where I know enough people that I can call them when I need them and say, "Hey, I need to learn about this particular subject. I don't need to quote you because I know your employer probably would frown upon you talking to me, but please, help me out here, help me understand this better." And that is probably one of the key ways to get at the information and context that I'm hoping to provide in my work. And then, the other aspect is too, like, I'm going to call the media relations people, and I feel like I have a good relationship with, just about, maybe not all the automakers, but, good working relationships. So you have those in the bank, and when there is a crisis or something they don't want to necessarily talk about, they can at least level with me and say, "Hey, here's our statement. We're not going to say anything more beyond that. We're not going to put our expert on the phone with you right now." And that's fine. Like I understand, as you referenced, there's some situations where for various reasons, liability probably high among them, that they don't want to say very much. And I think it kind of goes back to whether it's with media relations people or people on engineering teams at automakers, where having those relationships pre-existing, so I can have frank, candid conversations when need be.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I would say that's the same. It's very similar being an analyst as well, where we have a lot of conversations where in analyst reports we don't really quote people per se. That's not what we do. So it's a little different. Most people realize they're not going to be quoted. But even then, back when I was a journalist, I would have off the record conversations, and I would, I wouldn't say I would necessarily quote an anonymous source. I think I did it a couple times, but I would definitely have off the record conversations and try to be very clear about, okay, look, in general, I'm going to report on this, and I have to say the following because I want to provide context for the story and make sure my readers understand that I'm trying to provide what I view as a truthful view of what's going on. However, like, I'm not going to quote you. I don't want to get you in trouble. This is not gotcha journalism. I'm not trying to report on you personally and make your life difficult. So I think one of the challenges journalists face is getting sources to understand, like, look, it's a balancing act here. We want to tell the truth. We want to tell the public and our audiences what's going on as best we can. But we also understand there's some sensitive issues at people working for the OEMs and other companies in the supply chain. So we understand it's a balancing act. The problem is, even though we understand that, sometimes there can be issues in terms of getting as much information as we need and getting enough information about anything, say, news related, that say maybe like, especially in crisis management mode, to allow us to delve deeply into the topic. And the deadline pressure can also make it challenging. So in terms of, one of the things we want to do in this particular session is figure out what can the industry do to help journalists. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about, I think, what journalists can do as well, but what can we ask the industry to do to help us write, and most mainly as journalists, help journalists write accurate stories and report on what automakers are really doing and where they're at in terms of their ability to secure vehicle systems versus a lot of what gets reported on. One of the challenges I think that comes up in the way media portrays cybersecurity is a lot of times you'll see a hack or some researchers doing work, and it's on an older vehicle. It's a vehicle that's 4 or 5 years old, or even 2 or 3 years old. And of course, most people in the industry know that automotive timelines, if that vehicle came out and it was a 2019 model year car, yeah, well, it was designed and a lot of that was locked down back in 2-3 years before minimum. 39 months is the average time from design to production. So with that in mind, like there's a lag. What the OEM is doing today is newer, better, much more secure, better practices, but we don't hear about that. So what does the industry need to, how can the industry help journalists in terms of helping us get up to speed and report accurately on what's going on? So Pete, what's your take on that?
I think the short version would be something to the effect of, let's have these, background sessions that, we have typically when a new vehicle's launched. We, have these sessions where we hear all about the new, performance characteristics and design, et cetera. I think it'd be great if each automaker and supplier kind of held similar events to kind of debrief the media on cybersecurity issues, and do it, not when there's a kind of crisis in the news, so to speak. And that would, really kind of help build a broad base of understanding and context, with reporters who, especially those who don't cover the issue as often as, as I do, or kind of others who are regulars on that particular beat do. That's another kind of aspect of the media coverage. It's one thing for me to, and I was listening to some of the sessions before, and I was like, wow, I'm learning a lot here.
Right.
I felt I, know the topic, relatively well, not as well as, members of the audience here, but then there's, other reporters when there is a crisis who've never covered cybersecurity before, or, and then they're kind of on the story for the first time. And like that's the second part of the challenge, I think, is kind of getting to those media members beforehand.
Right. And I would say one of the challenges involved there, and Ed, I want you to talk about this next, but one of the things I've noticed is a lot of it depends on the kind of journalist you are and what kind of media outlet you're working for. If you are working as an automotive journalist, you know who your media people are. You often know suppliers. You know the right people to talk to, and you can often get a better story. When you're working more for like a technology publication, or even worse, you're in mainstream media, you work for CNN or you work for a Fox News outlet or something. I mean, if that's what your environment is, and you're expected to report on automotive cybersecurity all of a sudden for whatever reason, then unless you have something that has been out there that you can easily access, it can be really difficult for especially mainstream journalists to be able to write about anything authoritatively and portray an accurate version of what's going on. So from that perspective, I think automakers need to do more basic kind of grounding, basic material out there that explains some of the basic concepts, so that journalists who just don't know the subject and have never really covered it or covering it for the first time can actually get the info they need to write a story quickly and move on with their day, move on with their jobs. So Ed, what would you say in terms of, we're talking about this yesterday a bit. So in terms of how automakers go about doing that and how they go about communicating, what's your take on what they do well now and what they could do better with respect to cybersecurity in terms of the press releases and overall communications?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the challenge for the OEMs is, unfortunately, a lot of the coverage of this is kind of incident driven.
Right.
Like the Miller Valisic G-Pack, or this is a little bit out of this direct vertical, but the fatal Uber accident in Arizona a few years ago.
Right.
And then all of a sudden it just blows up in the headlines, and it's just, it's this whole conflagration of sensationalism. I think it really depends on the kind of culture and the importance of external communications by each OEM. There's one in particular, I'm not going to name them, but you might kind of have an idea of who they are. But one of the Detroit Three kind of pushes out a lot of what I'd consider kind of fluffy press releases, kind of arguably self-congratulatory, or just just kind of they'll put out releases on seemingly kind of insignificant little things. I don't want to disparage that. If that's what they feel is important, then that's all well and good. But I think maybe them or anyone else periodically could put out a little more substantive kind of explanatory releases on subjects such as cybersecurity, and just kind of put out their availability for journalists to talk to subject matter experts. But again, I think the challenge is as journalists, our instinct is to kind of chase the story sometimes. So, like I said, it's incident or crisis driven, and like, oh, we gotta do something on this. So that's a challenge for the OEMs in that if they're working on something really significant in cybersecurity or another initiative that they really have a story to tell on, is to make that compelling enough where journalists will want to do a story on it outside of a crisis or an incident, or at least as much where it'll stick in their head. They're like, oh yeah, I remember, Ford or Honda or whoever, they issued a release about this, or I went to a webinar or something. They might be a good resource, to quote for this. So that, again, getting back to the OEMs, when they're approached in, a crisis or incident driven story, that they're at least available enough to be able to lend some context and not be fearful of that reflecting badly on them. Because I think instinctively they're kind of crisis and risk averse, and they don't want to have egg on their face or feel like they're implicated in some sort of wrongdoing. They're just like hypersensitive about that.
Yeah, they don't want to face. They also want to face liability.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
the last thing
I think
is to make a statement and get sued.
Yeah, so I think they need to understand. Not every time you're being approached, it's gotcha journalism to try to put you in a bad light. Sometimes, we just honestly want to learn more about the subject and report on it more accurately. So
right, and I think we would rather report. I mean, if you're trying to report a relatively balanced story in general, you want to say like, okay, like, yes, this thing may have happened, there may have been a breach, even in crisis situations. But you also want to be able to say, like, give the OEM the opportunity to make a comment and say, like, okay, what are you doing? Have you fixed it? Maybe this is already fixed in newer vehicles. If so, anything that helps substantiate that, so it doesn't sound like a PR, like a soundbite, that would be great. Like, hey, can you give us a sentence or two that says, this is what we fixed. There was this issue, we fixed it this way. And it's a little more detailed than saying it's fixed, don't worry about it. I think one of the challenges in writing stories that your audience that lends your publication credibility and that helps your audience understand that, like, yeah, you really are trying to tell the right story, and lends credibility to the company you're talking about, say an automaker in this case, is them explaining a little bit more about what they are actually doing. One of the problems I think we run into with a lot of statements that you get from an automaker with an official statement is, this is no longer an issue on new vehicles, we have already fixed it. And that's fine, but that doesn't give anybody confidence. Everybody reads it and goes, really? Have they really fixed it? I've read all these stories about these startups who are saying vehicles aren't secure. What does this really mean? I mean, I don't know if I should believe that. And even as a journalist, you're like, okay, well, I want to believe you here, but in order for me to convince my audience, I really do need a bit more information here. So anything more you can provide would be helpful. Doesn't need to be detailed. I don't think any journalist is looking for like code examples. We're not looking for like to find out exactly what was fixed. But of course, this is where I want to talk a little about what a journalist need to do on our end, because one of the challenges I think automakers and other suppliers face in terms of communicating with journalists about cybersecurity is really complex. Everything from hardware, firmware, software, telecommunications, cloud, the whole 9 yards, right? Incredibly complicated subject. It's a whole ecosystem and universe in and of itself. And sometimes, even if an OEM tried to explain what the fix was, there's no guarantee the journalist would have any context for understanding what was fixed. So from our perspective, in my case, I'm an analyst. I have time to do more real deep dive research. But as a journalist, I had less time. And Pete, I'm sure you can talk about this. What do you think we can do on our end just to become more aware of the subject? Because, for example, for a long time, vehicle connectivity was kind of a new thing. EV powertrains, talking about that, 10 years ago, it was pretty new to be really delving deeply into that. I'm sure, Pete, given your area of coverage, you're covering all the new technologies. what are some best practices you have in place? What do you think we can do to make it easier so when an OEM or supplier explains something to us, we have a solid understanding of what it is they're talking about, especially if it's related to cybersecurity?
Sure. You know, it's interesting, and I'm going to back up a second. I think one of the hardest things about the job is, you know, no matter how much time you have to write the story, be it the, you know, the quick hit or the long one, is we're taking this very complex information that you mentioned and taking it from, you know, an audience like the one we have now who understands the subject inside and out. And then my challenge is to A, understand it, and B, sort of translate it for, you know, in my case at Automotive News, I always think of the car dealer in Omaha, Nebraska, who's reading, and you know, I need to simplify it enough that he or she understands it, yet explain it in, you know, with the right amount of nuance that the audience that's listening also says, hey, he knows his stuff. He kind of got that right. So that's always the challenge, I think, for me is it's just like, who's the audience for the story, and how do I straddle the line of telling that story so both the experts and the newcomers to the subject, you know, take something away from whatever I'm writing. But as far as best practices go, it just kind of goes back to what we've been talking about, relationship building over time. And that's, I think that's something that's kind of fallen away in the current media environment that we referenced early on, that we're in this digital environment now where there's pressure to write stories as often as 12 posts a day. And you know, I don't think my record approaches that, but I mean, that is the pressure so many people are under. And I think what falls by the wayside is the time to develop relationships. And maybe, you know, to answer the question would be to go back to what we said earlier. Like, I'd love a background session with automakers on the subject, even if it's off, you know, even if it's something we say, hey, like, this is for background information only, like, don't quote us on this, but we want to tell you about what we're doing. We want to tell you about the problems that we see and the challenges we face in a candid way, and tell you how we're working to combat them. Like, you know, I'd be interested in hearing from you more on, like, what do you think the media industry is really kind of getting wrong about automotive cybersecurity, and you know, what are the kind of the key areas that you think, you know, we reporters could work on better?
Actually, Joby, do you want to talk a little bit about this? Because this is an area where you had some very specific criticism. We got a couple minutes left. We're approaching the end of the panel, but I think it'd be good to, Joby, if you want to mention, you know, say the industry perspective, especially because of your background, it would be helpful to provide a little bit. What do you think journalists are getting wrong? What's your view on this?
Now, I don't like to mention specifics, and for those of you on here, I'll be audio only, I think. Sure. The biggest concerns I have is it kind of devalues almost kind of the work that I was doing when I was a cybersecurity architect. And it's like, well, the controls in place are so layered and nuanced that it's hard to say that one fixes everything, right? You know, people will claim that in the future that OTA will fix everything, when I really just don't think there's any panacea for security, right?
Sure.
And so kind of that, like, well, you're going to crash the vehicle because this tire pressure monitoring system malfunctioned, or it got an incorrect input. No, you might submit a warning light. There's a lot of other controls in place that prevent other sensors from being compromised, or it stops that kind of hop, right? But going back to what Pete said, I don't think there's enough education out there for the general public about what's going on, right? It's all this quote unquote industry secret. And we have 1 minute left, but I brought it up to Greg is this is an open invitation, right? Everyone out there can create resources about what the best standards and what everything is to do, newest information available. But we're looking for that level of collaboration at Geneva, right? Because when I worked at my previous OEM job, you know, I created an entire learning library of things that I bought, their PDFs, and shared them with my new onboarding, because it's hard to get experts in this field, right? Sure. So, you know, I would share all this information. We created onboarding guides. Why isn't that stuff available to journalists too? Like, if you want to learn about automotive cybersecurity, where do you go, right?
Right.
There's not coursework out there, right? I mean, it, and that's all I really have to say. But I really appreciate everyone joining the panel today. And it was a shorter panel, but I think that we touched on a lot of great subjects, and it's an open call to the industry. Like, let's talk about it. Let's get it out there. We're not marketing it as a sales benefit, right, for your customer. Why can't we talk about what we're doing, right? Let's make it better through collaboration and inclusion.
Right.
And let's get the reporting straight, because you guys want people to be engaged and interested. And it really can be an engaging and interesting subject. So
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And thanks to Pete and Ed.
Thank you.
And if you do have anybody from the audience has any questions, I didn't see any posted directly to the chat. I haven't checked in a minute though. Please follow up with them directly on the Swap Card platform. And thanks again.